My name is Rose Abramoff, and I'm a new faculty member in the School of Forest Resources. So I just started in January, a couple of months ago, and learned about the Climate Change Institute and thought it would be interesting to affiliate. So that's essentially what this talk is. And I'm going to describe a few research projects. I can, I mean, I can do my whole academic. Here are all of the places I've worked and or gone to school. I've bounced around a decent amount. I was living in Maine and working in my own tiny business for the last year or so. I have been in Maine for a little while, but I've also bounced around the country and world a decent amount. And I'll say, like, in general, my background is one that really started with forest ecology. And was based in fieldwork and lab work. But over the course of the postdocs that you saw, sort of both went from a kind of overall forest ecology and how plant roots work to sort of going further and further below ground into like how plant root exudates affect soil carbon and soil carbon cycling and soil carbon stabilization. And I also, partially due to COVID, but partially due to my own interest, became a lot more of a quantitative modeler, like a process-based modeler of how soil carbon changes over time. And so that's a lot of the work that I'll talk about today is sort of more based in the carbon cycling, below ground carbon cycle. But there aren't as many, the pictures of me kind of sitting in front of a computer are not as interesting to look at as the ones of fieldwork. So the basic outline of this talk, and I'm told I'll try and keep this to time, and if you have questions, we'll answer them, but I'm also told that at 1 we have a student defending, so we need to be out of here by then. So if needed, just know that like I'll linger in this kind of couch area if you want to chat with me afterwards. So the basic outline of this talk, I'll give a little bit of like general shared background and talk about a few studies. I'll actually spend a lot more time on, I'll spend most of the time on this first bullet, this how much carbon can be added to soil. Oh, you can't see that. Oh yeah, you can. Yay. And then I'll go more quickly through the how much more soil carbon will be released due to climate warming and the change in crop yields with future climate scenarios. So don't get worried when I seem to be spending a lot of time on bullet number 1. That's sort of part of the structure of the talk. Okay, so one of the things that you're probably familiar with, but I always like to throw up as a sort of first slide, is to drive home to everyone that even when we don't consider the permafrost carbon pool, soils store more carbon than all land vegetation in the atmosphere combined. And so they're really a large, potentially, and actively cycling, surprisingly actively cycling pool that is changing over time. And so it is both a potential feedback of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and a potential sink to sequester. The majority of climate crisis is caused by the burning of fossil fuels, which we know, but there's also a decent chunk of it which is due to the way that we use land and the kind of complete history of human land use of grazing, agriculture, and colonizing and urbanizing land. One of the things that I like to focus on is how much carbon we've lost over the entire history of sort of human agricultural civilization. And this isn't maybe the entire history, but this is one study from 2017 that uses the HIDE data set, if anyone's familiar with that kind of land use change data set, to try and estimate based on our best understanding of what lands have been exposed to agriculture and grazing, the sort of, and using a modeling technique, trying to understand the potential total loss and gain of soil carbon over time. And so this is a little that, if you can see this probability distribution, it's a little bit hard to see, but essentially the warmer colors indicate soil carbon loss and the sort of greeny bluer colors indicate gain. And you can see just in general that this is a very warm map. And this paper in particular estimated that over the last 12,000 years of human land use that we've lost approximately 116 gigatons of soil carbon in total. And because of that soil carbon debt, it there is also a decent amount of interest in the policy world. So this is one of those summary photos from the IPCC AR6. You may recognize that format in using changes in agriculture, afforestation, land use, and particularly, do I have a little red bar? Yeah. Different agricultural practices to store more carbon and have some mitigation scenarios. I always like to point out that these are all potential, they're all probably a lot more expensive than just changing our energy portfolio, particularly wind and solar. And all of these have very large error bars, and we can sort of talk about that in a minute. But that it is a potentially significant contribution to emissions reductions. Okay. But when we start to estimate soil carbon, it gets a lot murkier. And so because I come from a forest ecology background and I work with a lot of, microbial ecologists and pore water people, I feel like I have a bit of an appreciation for how complex soils are from the sort of field and lab work that I've done. And one of those elements of complexity is that soils are incredibly heterogeneous. Unlike aquatic ecosystems or the atmosphere, these are not well-mixed systems. They're very clumpy. So in this X-ray tomography that's just colored in the right hand side to show you porosity. So how gappy is it? Is it a clump, blue color, or is it empty space, red color? And you can basically see how clumpy soils are, and really not at all well mixed in terms of the places that have solids, that have liquid biofilms, that have gas. Really a big mixture of even those phases. And then when we get to the chemicals that are involved, like what types of constituents are in soil organic matter or soil minerals, it's more complex than that, right? So there are a lot of different chemical constituents of organic molecules that can stick onto mineral molecules in a lot of different ways. There are as well loads of microorganisms in the soil, as well as invertebrates and higher order organisms who live in and use soil. And so when we try and think of process-based models or statistical models of how to estimate the evolution of soil carbon over time, it can be a little bit daunting coming from a field or lab perspective, just the infinite complexity of how chemical, physical, and biological constituents in soil interact with each other. However, in practice, most carbon models, policymakers, and kind of carbon credit marketeers will use something that looks more or less like this, where soil carbon is a box of carbons that is a function of environmental variables. And sometimes this can be a statistical relationship like the above sort of format, or it can be a process model type relationship where we can track the change in the soil carbon pool over time as a function of inputs, outputs, and then each of these, fluxes can go to other pools, can be a function of environmental variables or a function of physical characteristics like pH or soil type or underlying parent material, et cetera. But essentially it's a box of undifferentiated carbons that we're keeping account of, which is not necessarily bad. I mean, we have to make simplifying assumptions. When I want to stay within this kind of policy context of carbon sequestration and keeping track of carbon for the purpose of sequestration. So I just wanted to lay out some of the sort of general best practices that most people agree upon when they talk about, whether or not we have sequestered carbon in a meaningful way. And so here are some of the characteristics that people often think about when they say, okay, we've sequestered carbon. The first is that the carbon that you add to an ecosystem has to be additional. So you have to add new soil carbon, which represents a change in policy. If a forest is growing back naturally, you don't necessarily get credit for that because that was already happening to begin with, for example. It has to be durable, and often marketeers will set quite arbitrary limits on how long carbon has to stay in the ecosystem, often at least 100 years. And we can talk about some of the ways in which it can be a little bit difficult to verify that. And then lastly, relatedly, has to be verifiable so that we know within some bounds of uncertainty that we've actually added more carbon to the ecosystem. Any questions so far? Okay, great. So, and I just wanted to say that we actually last year we put out this comment. It's not a scientific paper, but it's a comment going through a lot of the caveats that that my colleagues and I think need to be applied to some of these basic principles. Especially as relates to soil carbon offsets. It also tackles some of the conceptual issues with equating soil carbon sequestration with fossil carbon emissions. Fossil carbon has a much longer lifetime than soil carbon or biospheric carbon. So it sort of goes into some of those policy considerations. So if you're interested in that, you can go check out this paper. I want to stick to the sort of biophysical part of this though. So I want to talk a little bit more about what makes carbon durable, because a lot of people are interested in that, both from a purely scientific point of view and from this kind of policy point of view of, okay, how do we durably store carbon in soils or in the ecosystem in general? And so there are a couple of characteristics that soil carbon has that makes it more long-lived. And a couple of those are when soil is clumpy, when it aggregates, like in that X-ray tomograph image that I showed you earlier, it creates these, there's no whiteboard here, creates these sort of anoxic pockets, pockets where there might not be oxygen, there might not even be room for microorganisms to get in there, there might not be room for liquids for microorganisms to travel through, like biofilms, there might not be really enough access to substrate in general. And so, yes.
What's the scale?
Oh, very small microns.
Excuse me?
It's microns. I don't know exactly what the scale bar is because it's not there, but it's on the order of like microns to hundreds of microns. I can look it up and send it to you. But yeah, these are, so this is mineral. So the first one is basically aggregates. When you have a giant clump, it can be hard to decompose anything from the inside of it just because you simply don't have access. The second is mineral association. And so in this SEM and the NanoSims photo, which is actually the same photo with a kind of isotopic label that highlights organic matter. So the yellow is organic matter. You can see that organic matter can stick onto mineral surfaces in ways where it might occlude microorganisms from accessing that organic matter. And so mineral association is also considered one way that we might inhibit decomposition. Although there are a lot of more nuanced theories for each of these about like how much decomposition is inhibited, what kinds of complexation are happening, and how inhibitory are those. Like, for example, there are different types of mineral surfaces, like primary or secondary minerals that can be more or less weathered and more or less reactive and therefore sticky to our types to organic matter. I might have a slide that references that later. So anyway, there are these kind of broad categories of things that are associated with minerals, either by being directly sorbed, stuck onto a mineral surface, or having organic matter be sort of clumped with little bits of minerals, fungal hyphae, root exudates, microbial necromass, the dead bodies of microorganisms in just a kind of gooey clump that's difficult to access. Both of these types of carbon are often heavier, and they have certain physical and chemical properties that make it possible for experimentalists to separate them from particulate matter, which is a sort of, you know, like a partially decomposed leaf, castings of invertebrates, things that aren't necessarily stuck onto anything else and are just like organic, light, partially decomposed plant matter, plant or animal matter. And so one of the ways that people try and understand whether carbon is older or more durable is by separating the soil out into these different fractions and estimating how old each of them is to try and basically create functional groups in soil, as opposed to looking at the whole thing as a monolith. And so there are a lot of different ways to do that. There's two kind of popular classes of what we call fractionation, splitting soil into different functional groups. One is particle size fractionation, where you basically put soil through smaller and smaller sieves of particular sizes until you have, things that are very small, like very small clumps, larger clumps, particles, and sometimes also kind of sonicating or dispersing soil with some amount of energy to try and release like aggregates of different sizes and stabilities, like macro or micro aggregates. There's another way of doing it, which is very popular, which is density fractionation. And sometimes these are combined, which makes it really hard for us to sort of say like what each of these categories actually denotes, because there are so many different ways of separating soil out. But basically the idea is that, okay, things that are sorbed minerals that have little bits of minerals in them are heavier because rocks are heavier than decomposing plant matter. And so when you put them in a solvent of known density, they float. They sink to the bottom where particulate matter floats to the top. And so there are density fractionation techniques that essentially separate things into categories of, are you heavy? Are you associated with rock particles, or are you not? And so this graph on the right is just showing you a density fractionation technique where essentially they separated bulk soil, which is in gray here, these gray dots, into two other fractions. The free light fraction, which represents the lighter, more particulate matter, the things that floated to the top of a solvent of known density, and the dense fraction, the things that sunk to the bottom. And what you can see is that, sorry, and who's familiar with 14C radiocarbon as an age tracer? Raise your hand. Okay, we got a couple. So in the mid-century, we set off a lot of bombs. It released a lot of 14C radiocarbon into the atmosphere, and which was then taken up by plants, and plants decomposed, and they went into this, and they decomposed and became part of soil. And as a result, we have a kind of tracer due to bombs that allows us to understand approximately how old organic matter is. So it can be a little bit controversial to understand, to assign a specific age to a delta 14C radiocarbon value. And that's mostly because you have to make a lot of assumptions, not a lot, you have to make a few assumptions. Some of them are a little bit controversial. And sometimes now, because that signal is decaying more, there can be two solutions and you have to sort of choose between them based on other characteristics. We're not assigning an age here on the x-axis, but basically the more negative you go, the older it is. Oh, good, I put an arrow, that's handy. And so what you can see here is essentially that this dense fraction, especially at depth, is much older than the light fraction, which is essentially modern, if that makes sense. Okay, there's been other work, excuse me, there we go. There's been other work looking at the age distribution of carbon, of soil carbon in particular. And this is a kind of like broader analysis put together by someone else that I'm just showing because I want you to sort of understand that the age distribution of soil carbon in particular is not normally distributed. It has this very long tail. So a great majority of soil carbon is actually pretty modern, pretty recently fixed from the atmosphere, fairly actively cycling. But then there's this smaller proportion of it that can be very, very old, either because it's sorbed or it's in a very strong aggregate, or actually at these very high year numbers, probably it's pyrogenic carbon. It can even be rock-derived carbon. So there are basically very small fractions of this pool that are super, super old that kind of drag the mean age up. In a way that also makes it kind of difficult to model, because in most of our models, remember I showed you that box that was just a bunch of soil carbons. In a model like that, we often assume that all the carbons in that box are evenly mixed. They have even ages. But some people don't do, some people have distributions assigned to them.
Where is this study here?
Sorry?
Where are these soils?
This is a global analysis. Yeah. That's why it's in Nature Geoscience. But this is common. This is a kind of common shape of a distribution, even if you're looking at a number of samples in a very specific area. So it is often the case that, most of the carbon that you see in a given sample, here in Maine will be mostly young, and then a very small proportion, very, very old. Any other questions?
Not in the Arctic though, right?
Well, the Arctic is a special case because it's basically a freezer that nothing decomposes it. Right. I forget there are a lot of kind of Arctic focused people here. Yeah. So I mean, most soils on Earth are more mineral soils. They've undergone some amount of weathering and they don't have the special condition that the Arctic has, which is essentially a freezer into which you throw things and nothing decomposes. So yeah. Good point. Thanks, Dan.
I had the same question about where that was.
Yeah.
It's different. You were saying some of us have curves and we do, but it depends on what the shape of that curve is.
Yeah. If the people online can't hear Dan, can the people online hear?
Cryoturbation.
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. Dan just said cryoturbation. Great. Right. So this is sort of this is more of a kind of global mineral soils focused talk. I will get to the Arctic towards the end of the talk, to permafrost, but I think of permafrost as a very special case when it comes to soils. Okay, so there have been a lot of ways over the years to try and estimate how much carbon soils can absorb, and a lot of them are very empirical, very clunky. So for example, this guy Jan Hessink in the 90s looked at a bunch of soils in the Netherlands and basically compared soils that were from farmlands that had been somewhat degraded versus natural grasslands, and basically said, okay, we assume the natural state has as much carbon as it could reasonably have, and these farms are somewhat degraded. And so he basically used that to create this relationship of like, okay, what is the maximum amount of soil you can store in this kind of mineral associated, this durable fraction? And this relationship was essentially one where the maximum amount of carbon you can store in this mineral fraction is a function of the soil physical characteristics, like how many minerals are available, which is why in this plot that you can see over here, the x-axis is essentially particles under 20 microns. So that's like silt and clay particles, like the relative abundance of silt and clay particles versus the carbon in that fraction. And lo and behold, it was a kind of useful line that's actually still used today by managers, even though it's quite simple. Since then, there have been some attempts to update this with a lot more data from other places in the world. So this is a more global study. There have been a couple more global studies that use essentially boundary line analysis, which is a fancy way of saying we looked at the top 95th percentile and we drew a line there. And that's the most carbon you can store in the mineral associated fraction, because that's the most that we have observed. And so that's basically the principle behind boundary line analysis. If anyone says that, you sort of understand what it actually means. And here, sometimes they'll separate it out between, for example, here's the low activity and the high activity minerals. So minerals with lower activity that have gone through more weathering and are less reactive don't accumulate as much carbon, don't stick as much carbon to them than high activity minerals, according to this kind of very simplistic analysis. And so this is a kind of interesting way to estimate things. I did a study a couple of years ago where I tried to do it in a bit more of a mechanistic way using a set of experiments called sorption experiments, where essentially we take a cuvette filled with soils, different types of soils from different places in the world, from different soil orders, and we shake them with different levels, with different concentrations of dissolved organic carbon, sort of incubate them together, filter that down, and then analyze the supernatant to see how much of that carbon stuck on to the soil that was there. And by using different concentrations, increasing concentrations of dissolved organic carbon, you can come up with this kind of curve where basically the more DOC you add more and more and more, like less and less of it will stick on, and you sort of approach this asymptote, which is the kind of theoretical maximum amount of carbon that this soil can additionally stick to. And so we sort of created this relationship, and we upscaled this relationship, for better or worse, to try and understand potential global patterns in how much carbon could be additionally stuck to soils using this method. Interestingly, so we only had 6 soil orders here, but it includes mollisols and some of the more like agriculturally used soils in the world. And it was interesting to see that our kind of like like kind of back of the envelope scale up number was actually quite similar to the amount of soil carbon that has been lost from the, 12,000 years of agriculture. So it's a sort of similar magnitude, which I think is kind of interesting. It doesn't mean it's right. It just means that it's interesting. And so any questions about this? Okay. So it still makes modeling, even though we have potentially more parameters for how much carbon can stick to soils, the way that protected carbon functions from these types of experiments, it's still really hard to predict how this durable carbon will change, or even total bulk carbon. So this was a study in 2018 of a colleague of mine who compared a bunch of different soil carbon models to each other, and under a couple of canonical like warming experiments or double input experiments, and they all function in totally different ways. They sort of make different predictions. And the protected carbon changes in different ways. So these models, which have all been fitted to their own data sets in different parts of the world, don't really agree with each other, even though they function reasonably in other contexts. And because in most mineral soils, the protected fraction is actually the majority of carbon. Particulate is usually a smaller fraction than this kind of mineral associated fraction. It tends to change the whole way that bulk soil works. So again, these models don't really agree with each other in terms of how carbon dioxide fluxes or total soil carbon changes with these global warming experiments. Which is to say that we just don't necessarily have enough information to understand how protected carbon or even bulk carbon change. One of the things that's interesting about this study is that if you look at these gray points in each of these plots, those are the meta-analysis data that we pulled to try and decide, oh, which of these models is correct. And we weren't really able to say that any one of these models is better than any of the others, because these data, particularly if you look at, like changes in soil, total soil carbon with double inputs, these data span the full gamut of these models. We just don't really have enough of them in any situation. Some people, especially those who are interested in trying to assign value to changes in soil carbon, have tried to embrace this uncertainty by saying, oh, well, we'll just use model ensembles to estimate, the total uncertainty of changes in carbon. And so this is a study with a postdoc that I worked with a few years ago, who basically looked at 16 cropland sites across Europe that were all adding extra organic matter to soil with an idea to maybe build up soil organic carbon. And she calculated how much carbon would need to be added per year to these sites to increase soil carbon stocks by a certain amount, by 0.4% over 30 years. This 0.4% number comes from this kind of EU-wide initiative called 4 per mil, which is basically this back of the envelope calculation of, oh, if like all of the arable land in Europe did something like this and increase soil carbon stocks by this percent, we would, theoretically offset anthropogenic emissions. Very controversial because of its logistic impossibility, particularly when you look at the nutrient requirements that you would need to fulfill that carbon input. But anyway, putting that aside, so you can make this estimation. You can use a bunch of different models, all of which have very different predictions, all reasonable, but all different, to come up with this sort of, error that is the same order of magnitude as the input itself, right? It's quite large. And you can try and assign changes based on that, but it can be difficult because, for example, there's a very small window in understanding whether we've actually increased carbon at all, right? Given the error in a lot of situations. One of the problems these types of modeling techniques also run into is the fact that a lot of them, including this exercise here, don't take into account the changes in climate that we're likely to see over these periods. So sometimes these are only decadal simulations where they're looking at near-term changes for a few years out to 10 or 20 years. But sometimes these are like end-of-century simulations that don't necessarily take future climate into account. And of course, as most of the people in this room probably know, Dan, this is your figure again, just showing that like soil organic matter is a source, and it's becoming a source. in Maine specifically. And it is also, when we're trying to decide how much carbon to add, we have to understand what our baseline is. So not only is our baseline sometimes behind, behind us, like we have to rebuild carbon before we can then add something additional. That baseline is also the starting line or whatever, is like every year moves further away from us. And so it's an important thing to take into account. And so that sort of brings me, hopefully, conceptually to my next point, which is how much soil carbon release do we expect to see with future warming? This will focus on a specific location in permafrost, Alaska. So this was a warming study that we did, gosh, about 10 years ago. Margaret Torn at Lawrence Berkeley Lab led it, although I am the first author of the data product, which you can download it while it's still there, guys. Okay, so this was a warming experiment from what used to be called Barrow, Alaska, and was renamed Keokvik, Alaska recently. This is kind of classic polygonal tundra. Basically, here's what one of the plots looks like. And we set up 4 plots of powered by a solar panel with a warming rod from the surface down to 50 centimeters, which is approximately the end of the active layer in the summer, the lowest point in the active layer, with some, temperature measurements, and then made measurements of both carbon dioxide and methane respiration, soil respiration over time. And so this plot on the left is just showing that this experiment was reasonably able to maintain a kind of 4-degree warming difference throughout the profile. That was the warming level that was chosen, a little bit less at both very surface and very deep, but reasonably well maintained. And that overall, across these 2 warming seasons of collection, we saw an increase in ecosystem respiration by about 30%. So this plot, you can see just the heated or the kind of orange bars and the control or the blue bars, and there's a difference between them. There's an interesting story to do with this October 2015 period. And these shaded areas represent times in which the heaters were either not on because it was the warm-up pre-collection period, or because in these later periods of mechanical issues in this remote location. So one of the things that I did for this study was to try and understand how much more carbon release we might see based on the temperature sensitivity that we measured. So a lot of Earth system models use a very kind of standard intrinsic temperature sensitivity, this index called Q10, which basically tells you what the change in reaction rate will be for every 10-degree change in temperature. And so a lot of times it's set to this kind of canonical 2, which is based on a lot of kind of previous historical research. We actually found a higher temperature sensitivity index of 2.8 based on this study. And so wanted to scale that number up and try and understand how much more ecosystem respiration would we see if models were using this higher temperature sensitivity, which we found based on our measurements. So we did that using output from the community Earth system model for these 4 colors. Each represent the 4 shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios from the IPCC, the sort of like best to worst case cascade of scenarios, which you're probably familiar with. And you can see that, so the solid lines are assuming a Q10 of 2, and the dotted lines are assuming this higher Q10 of 2.8. And you can see that the dotted lines, I hope you can see it, may be a little bit hard, except in this SSP 585 case, that they're all higher. And so that corresponds to, and this is sort of summed across the Arctic tundra, masking out everything else. And this would correspond to about 2 to 10 petagrams of carbon dioxide per year underestimate of ecosystem respiration by the end of the century. So that's a potentially, again, this is a sort of back of the envelope scaling, but it is a potentially a large underestimate, particularly if we also find this high of a temperature sensitivity at other locations across the Arctic. Okay. But, I think a lot of us who study climate science tend to think about carbon, and I've spent most of this talking about carbons. And that is what we tend to use as a measurable quantity. But I think it's also important to understand that the way that the climate crisis will affect a lot of other people is really in ways that change how much food costs and how much land you're able to use and how much land we're able to use in an economic way. And so this next study is looking at changes in crop yields for different future climate well, we just focus on one future climate scenario here. And so this is a paper that came out a couple of years ago, and it's really a synthesis of crop model predictions. So these are individual site level predictions from a variety of different crop models. So thousands of predictions in hundreds of locations for each of the 4 major crops, maize, rice, wheat, and soybean. And what we did, we tested a bunch of different statistical models to synthesize all of these data and try and come up with like a consensus model that explains future changes in these 4 major crops from all of these simulations. And so we tested a whole bunch of different machine learning models with a number of different, either location or spatial error terms, or environment or adaptation practices. And when I say those words, what I mean with environmental variables, we had things like the average temperature and the average precipitation for that location, the change in temperature or precipitation from a baseline, which was the year 2005, and the carbon dioxide concentration in parts per million. And then we also had location information. And then we had this interesting categorical variable of adaptation, which in the slides that I'll show you today is just a yes or no categorical variable indicating whether or not any adaptive practices were implemented. If you go through the paper, you can see it broken out into some like specific types of adaptive practices and sort of which crops respond more to each of those. So those included things like changes in fertilizer application and irrigation practices in this cultivar that was used, the sort of like type of plant that was planted, soil organic matter management, so like adding residue, for example, planting time, tillage, etc. There's a category called others that just encompassed anything else that didn't fall into those other categories, like agroforestry, for example. Okay, so we tested a lot of these models. We chose the highest performing ones. And in these sort of global maps, we sort of summarize the projected average crop yield loss, depending on the crop, depending on the location, between 6 and 21%. And this is RCPs and not SSPs because it's an earlier iteration from AR5. So this is RCP 4.5, kind of middle of the road scenario. But we also found that adaptation alleviates that yield loss by 1 to 13 percentage points. So while it's not possible to entirely alleviate crop yield loss, it is partially possible on average. So, and when you look at specific areas in the globe, you see some kind of interesting patterns. So this is just maize, and you can go to the paper and look at the others. So this is the projected percent yield change. So brown is losses. This kind of green-blue color is gains. And you can see without any adaptive practices, there's kind of widespread loss. With adaptive practices, you can actually see some gains in yield at the higher latitudes, which is also just interesting to point out that, while people who live in the lower latitudes are largely not responsible for any of fossil fuel emissions, historical excess fossil fuel emissions, they will suffer the most projected yield loss. And that's not just my study. I mean, most studies that look at agricultural projections note that sort of fundamental injustice. And then the difference between the two, showing essentially that you can regain some yield by implementing some adaptive practice. One last thing that we did was so machine learning models tend to be kind of a black box, but you can still sort of interpret them in a way that is not mathematically like linear regression coefficients, but is sort of similar in its output to that. So there's this interpretive method called Shapley additive explanations that essentially uses game theory to try and understand and rank the factors, like the predictors in the model, and how much they're affecting the mean change in the anomaly, the difference from the mean across all grid cells. And so, for example, I think the best way to understand this is by an example. So for example, nope, that's too much. Not having adaptation in this specific, this is sort of a Shapley additive explanation for one grid cell. Not having adaptation in this grid cell causes a 4% lower yield. This is the percent contribution than the mean across all grid cells. So it's showing you the sort of importance of having adaptation, or in this case, not having adaptation related to the other inputs to the model, like the average temperature, the latitude and longitude, the change in temperature, the CO2 concentration. And so one of the things we can do using these interpretive factors is say, okay, which one of these inputs to the model was the most important for explaining the yield change anomaly? And so that's what we did in this plot, which shows which of the factors, they're in different colors down below. Adaptation is pink, is the main one to think about. Which is the most important. And you can see that while with soybean and wheat, there are kind of a lot of things related to precipitation and temperature that are important in different grid cells. For maize, for example, and largely for rice, whether or not there's some kind of adaptive practice was the most important in explaining what the change in yield was with this future climate scenario. So that was kind of interesting. And there's more plots in the paper that you can look at that asks similar questions. So the basic conclusion of this study is based on this synthesis of crop model predictions. Again, these are model predictions, they're not actual data, so take that with a grain of salt, that we would expect crop yields to decline by this 6 to 21% globally, but that adaptation alleviates that yield loss potentially, and that there are gains in yield possible with adaptive practices at high latitudes, but not at low latitudes, generally speaking. Any questions about this? Okay, if that was super, if you did not hate that so much, you might consider taking my class, which is not starting, I don't know, do we have any students here? Hi, I'm only talking to you. So I'm not teaching this class this next semester, but in spring of 2026, I'm giving a modeling ecological data class, which will look at a wide variety of like statistical and process-based models to understand these kind of large, messy data sets. So if that sounds like so much fun, please consider taking that course. And that's my last slide. I think I just wanted to advertise. Yeah, I will.
So you took us through a very delightful tour from very microscopic scale to the globe. Where do you think what scale is going to be the biggest return on investment to focus on for, say, yourself?
I think most of the things that I'm brainstorming now focus much more locally. Because I think they're the types of changes that we make locally can have a much greater impact, and we can measure that impact in a much more like understandable way, verifiable way. Global carbon models, Earth system models, and like machine learning upscaling things are all easy to fund and people enjoy them. But they have to make a lot of simplifying assumptions, and therefore there's a lot of uncertainty in the recommendations that you would have, right? Like we should maybe do adaptive agriculture. Like anybody who does agriculture on the ground will tell you that I did not give them any new information today. And so I do think that there is benefit to working with local practitioners and answering their questions. There is a study that I didn't put in here, that mostly because it's not part of my like academic work writ large, but there's this collaboration that I've been doing with an NGO called Earth Justice, and they have been doing work on evaluating models that the EPA puts out to try and understand the emission of different pollutants from large animal feeding operations, which is kind of a total departure from soil, but is still related to agriculture. And it's been really fun. It's been both intellectually stimulating and kind of specifically rewarding to try and work on this puzzle that has this very specific, very tangible public policy implication. And so I'm hoping to do more things like that, probably not getting into air pollution, but related to my existing work in forests and soil. Yeah, good question. But I mean, giant models up until now have pay the bills. I don't know if I can be this frank on an academic time. Yeah.
Hey, this was really fun. Thanks for sharing all of that. I have kind of a question that intersects a bit more with your communication work, sort of the interface of the two. You've probably seen this as well, like this idea of safe soil sort of popping up in a lot of social media spaces. And I'm really curious, as someone who thinks a lot about messaging and frameworks, and also who works directly in this field, I've been really kind of skeptical of the save soil message, because it feels like, on the one hand, yes, we should be saving soil, but it's often sort of presented as the silver bullet solution, and I wonder if it has sort of nefarious origins in terms of, oh, we can keep, it's not fossil fuels, we just need to work on soil. And I don't know if you've thought much about that. I'm just sort of curious.
Oh, I think about that all the time. Yeah. I mean, there's always this kind of like evolving push from the side of corporatists in general to distract us from rapidly ramping down the fossil fuel industry by pulling out these other things, by saying like, oh yeah, like 13 to 21% of this is caused by animal agriculture, and we have to like graze in a slightly different way. And it's usually not, we need to ramp down animal industrial agriculture, which I would agree with. But it's like, oh, we need to do things in a slightly different way, or we need to inoculate the soil with cool fungi that will sequester soil carbon. And it's interesting to me that a lot of these solutions only work with a very narrow accounting of the energy and carbon costs, right? So often you'll see, for example, in this study, and this isn't a lot of, if you should read the comment we wrote, because we ran quite liberally about this. You'll see like European studies like this one where they'll say, okay, if we add this much carbon, we'll increase soil carbon by that per year, and that's the total sequestration. Doesn't take into account that the cows that pooped the exogenous organic matter, that they pooped on soil probably, and that poop was going to go into that soil. So it's not necessarily additional. Maybe what you did was you gathered up all that poop using human manpower, diesel-powered tractors, which emit carbon as they function, and then put it in a truck that was probably also powered by fossil fuels, and you drove it to some other farm to put it on the ground in a way that was being experimentally tracked for carbon credits. So there are a lot of issues related to, and I didn't put those other concepts up there related to like leakage, that if you don't do something here, it might happen somewhere else in a place with less environmental regulation or tracking. And sort of more inclusive life cycle analyses. I think one of the reasons why most industries aren't interested in doing that, apart from this, I mean, it is kind of related to the profit motive, but it's essentially that if you have an expansive enough understanding of the cost of doing something, you come to realize that perhaps the easiest way to solve the climate crisis is to not do stuff, right? Like work from home, expand public transportation, like have social services so that we don't have to create whole new industries with executives who are flying around constantly to make carbon deals, like creating new office spaces to have like the whole idea that we have to like create jobs and that is and grow our way out of this is a kind of economic red herring that doesn't, in my opinion, work over the long term. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, I don't, it's hard to message your way out of that without transitioning from a message based on resource use without folding in kind of economic and political messaging. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I will ask you, Rose, more existential question. You, so this is a CCI affiliation talk, and at the beginning you said you signed up for this because you thought it would be fun. So I wondered if you could elaborate on that. Like, how do you see yourself interacting with the CCI? What kind of collaborations could happen?
Yeah, well, I think it could be a kind of good separate wing because I just gave a talk last week in the School of Forest Resources that was about all my specifically forestry studies, but I have a lot of studies like this and research interests that don't really have to do with forests or a little bit more expansive than that specific type of land. And so I thought CCI would be a nice, but they do all have to do with global change, right? Like even most of the forest studies have to do with changes in climate effects, forest fragmentation, changes in land use, which I think would probably fit under this umbrella as well. And so it seems like a good place to house like all of the elements of my research program that don't relate to forestry. Is my kind of more pragmatic thinking, because I am still interested in like building out that part of my research program. Yeah. Okay. Well, we have to leave kind of soon. So I will just go loiter out there if people want to chat with me. And ask me more questions. Thank you so much for your attendance. Oh, Ivan says Maine recently launched a soil health program. What are your thoughts on our ability to measure the benefit of funded practices on? Oh my God. Okay, we'll have to answer that offline. Soil health is tough because it encompasses a lot of different things. But I mean, you know, that doesn't stop people from making indices about it all the time with like random weights assigned to like biodiversity and like water quality and whatnot. So, I mean, you can do it. Okay, we can talk more later. Thank you. I'm going to close this Zoom. Bye.